So we have a mindset in Australia, right, that the government should fix everything. That if something goes wrong, immediately the media are, the government should do something about it. And I play this game with people where I say, listen to an ABC news bulletin, right? And then after each story say, and the government should do something about it. And it works 99% of the time.
And,
right?
and worse, the person that they've used as the example of this, suddenly, because they're a victim, becomes an instant expert on what you can do. And the next thing you know, they're Australian of the Year, and they're telling us we all need to spend another $1 billion on this problem, and because I've suffered from this problem, I know what to do.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
G'day and welcome to the 4th episode of The Other Side Interviews, our Tuesday night interview show that complements our weekly main show on Friday nights, The Other Side Australia, your weekly news and commentary summary show. My guest tonight on interviews is Graham Young. Graham is the Executive Director of the Australian Institute for Progress. It's a classical liberal policy think tank. He's a pollster and a political consultant and an occasional columnist for The Australian and The Australian Financial Review. In the 90s, Graham was a vice president and campaign chairman for the Liberal Party of Australia. For our international viewers, that's Australia's centre-right party, our Conservative or Republican Party equivalent, if you like. Although these days, who knows really. The Australian Institute for Progress is a think tank that exists to advance the cause of the classic rights: freedom of expression, freedom of association, property rights, and freedom of worship, and most of all, freedom of markets. You were one of the founders, Graham, I understand, is that right?
That's right, yeah.
Welcome to the Other Side Interviews.
Yeah, it's a pleasure being here, Dave.
Good to have you here.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about why you set it up. Why did you set the AIP up?
Well, I started in the new media space back in '99. Got really excited about the internet and set up an online journal called Online Opinion.
Right.
And the premise was a classical liberal premise that you bring opposing viewpoints together and let them duke it out, and the observer can work out where the truth lies. So after 10 or 15 years of doing that, got a bit tired of giving my enemies a platform. So I decided that possibly I needed to get into the ring myself.
Right.
So we set up the Institute. People are often frustrated, and I can hear that in your voice, that politicians don't stand up and argue particular points. But I think you misconceive the role of the politician. The role of the politician is to broker a deal with the electorate and put them into power where they can implement as much of an agenda as they can. But for most of them, to talk too much about that agenda gets them into trouble and robs them of the ability to do that brokering job. So they need people like us to open what they call the Overton window.
Yeah.
So that range of opinions which is acceptable.
That's a political science theory, right? The Overton window, the range of acceptable opinions to talk about can shift.
I'd call it not so much a theory as a observation. The debates, people will say things, people would have said things 20 years ago that today we would say is mad. And people say things today, like a man can be a woman, that maybe in 20 years' time they'll think is mad. But at the moment, it's actually acceptable in politics to say that a man can be a woman. So, that's a sign of the window sort of moving around.
Right, I see.
So our job is to, I'm not going to open it on that side, but open it a bit more on this side so we get more of a normalcy, and that's where the politicians come in.
Right.
We make the bullets, they fire the guns.
Right. My own brief flirtation with politics suggested to me that it is very much a difficult thing to kind of try and change the thinking, that you really have to engage with the electorate. You're really there to represent them where they're at, and I guess that is the job, right? Yeah.
Well, no,
and lead a bit.
My view of what politicians should be doing is, yes, they should be leading, but they have a saying about pioneers that you don't want to be a pioneer because they always get shot in the back.
Right.
So a politician wants to be on the front foot, but not that far in front that his enemies are going to be all behind him or her, and it ends up being a disaster. Plus, it's a bit like business. You have a certain amount of capital when you go in this case, votes and acceptability and credibility, and sometimes they'll spend some of that to do something they think's worthwhile, but they've only got such a size pile, and if they spend more than they have, then they lose the election, and then they lose the ability to do any good.
Yeah. So I guess we need to be a little bit more sympathetic to the Liberal Party than constantly bashing them for a lack of leadership.
Politicians. Look, I'm sympathetic to all politicians. I think most of them go in there for the right reasons. Some of them aren't particularly skillful at the policy side, but it's a team. You don't want everyone to be necessarily skillful at the policy side. You want some people who've got the empathy and the administrative skills and so on to make a whole.
Yeah.
But you know, it's a bit like insurance salesmen. Everyone hates insurance salesmen, apart from the one that sells them insurance. Politicians are a bit like that. Everyone hates politicians, but the one that represents you. Yeah,
that's right. But Graham, you're joining us tonight to talk about the federal budget, and it is budget night as we stream out live on ADH at 6 p.m. We've got the budget coming up at 7:30 this evening. But we're not going to talk about the detail of the budget. We're really here to talk about, in general terms, philosophically, approaches to government, approaches to spending, how it all works, the system of government works. There's a lot of people, we don't get that education in school as much as we should, do we?
Well, I never got any at school, so I'm not sure that's a new thing.
No, it's astounding.
But the education you do get at school tends to be a sort of collectivist, we all ought to care about things, and you don't get the education that there's a cost to everything that you do.
Yeah.
Whatever choice you make, you know, if you decide to go to the beach this weekend, it means you can't go to the mountains.
Yep.
But we try and have all our cake and eat it too when it comes to politics. So, you know, we want politicians to give us everything that we want, but, you know, everyone can't have everything because the costs will outweigh the benefits. And we don't learn that at school.
That's right. And this is where the rubber hits the road, right? The budget is basically the government saying, okay, we have this pool of tax money. Are we going to increase that pool of tax money by taxing people more or not? Given the pool that we've got, how are we going to divide up the pie? Who's going to get what and how we're going to spend it in the most efficient way. Obviously, politics tends to get involved sometimes, and decisions are not made for maximum efficiency economically or maximum benefit, but sometimes just for, you know, the result of politics and lobbying and things.
Well, that's where that brokerage function comes in. And one of my criticisms of this government is it doesn't appear to have a strategy. It's got a list of promises it's made to people who've supported it to get into power, and it's ticking it off. Aged care. There aren't enough nurses to guarantee 24/7 care, but it's in the budget that we're going to do that. Childcare. You know, everyone wants childcare and they don't want to pay for it. So, okay, there you go. Parental leave. There you go. This won't be in the budget because it's industrial relations, but, you know, the unions don't like individual contracts. They don't like enterprise bargaining. So, okay, we go back to the 60s. And that has budget consequences because the reason we're not in the 60s is because we worked out in the 80s that wasn't the way to run a good country.
Right. So, just dive into that a little bit. So, in the 60s we were doing what?
We're a highly protected economy.
Yeah.
So we believed that, you know, we had to make our own cars, our own clothes, just a whole range of manufacturing. Back then, you know, maybe 20 million, probably less than that. Would have been less than 20 million people.
Yep.
You can't do that efficiently. Like the US might be able to. So Australia versus the US, 25 million at the moment, about 300 million. Well, 300 million people, there's a lot of people you can delegate out manufacturing to and do it efficiently. But in 25 million, you don't get those economies of scale that you need. So what we had to do was reinvent the economy, get rid of tariffs, subsidies, and that happened under both sides of government. But, you know, Paul Keating gets most of the credit and he deserves it. Gough Whitlam was actually good on this.
Was he?
Yep. Yep.
Okay, so tariffs and subsidies are there to protect local industry from imports that would be a lot cheaper because they're more efficient overseas, making cars and things. They bring them in, so we had to keep our own car industry propped up. People would say nowadays that we've gone too far the other way. We're too dependent upon the international economy and international manufacturing, and we need to start manufacturing some more stuff at home. That seems to be the current thinking. What's your response to that?
So the problem with that thinking is that it's sort of half the balance sheet thinking, because yes, you might be protecting a job in manufacturing, but you're penalising a job in export.
Yeah.
And if you think about it, you know, we pride ourselves on being an exporting nation. But if we won't buy anyone else's goods, why should they buy ours?
Yeah.
So you damage your economy, and the industries that you're really good at, which provide high standards of living, and mining and agriculture are two of them, education's another one, they get penalised because you're funneling all this money and resources and you're misallocating it to manufacturing that you can't do particularly well.
There's a defence and security issue to this too, right?
Yeah. That's where I was going to go, but there is a defence angle to it. We're a long way from anywhere, and if there were a serious attempt to invade the country, trying to get new tanks here, just oil. You know, we've only got about a month, I think it is, of reserves. We've got the requisite number of reserves. We just bought the petrol when it was less than zero in the US, and it's still in bunkers in the US.
Right.
So we say, oh yeah, we meet the requirements, but how do you get it from there to here? And in these days where you've got satellites and aerial reconnaissance and drones and goodness knows what, I wouldn't want to be out there in a ship in the merchant marine with a whole lot of oil sitting under me. I think the chances of it getting here without a very big conflagration would be about zero.
Right. So we need to have at least some security.
We need some resilience, and that's going to cost us, and it will cost the economy. But you know, it's like paying an insurance premium. The insurance premium costs your business money. For most of us, it's not necessary during our life, or it's not called on during our lifetime, but it's there because the risk of the catastrophic event is sufficient that a little bit of inefficiency, paying a middleman to aggregate the risk together so that we won't get into that problem is worth it. So yes, we need to take out more insurance in the economy.
Okay, so let's look at the budget, right? So the government spends about $650 billion a year, I think is what the government, that's the total amount of money
it could
we've
be.
got.
It's varies from year to year, we'll find out.
Yeah. So that's the tax revenue that's coming in. Now they've just had
Not always.
No. So, but they've just had a bit of a windfall this year because of bracket creep, which is the phenomenon that, you know, with inflation and wage rises, more people are falling into higher tax brackets. So taxes are going up, actually, but without them going up, if you know what I mean. So we've got that factor happening. But they've also had a big windfall around gas royalties, coal royalties, and iron ore, which are our three biggies. Without that, if you take that away, and of course net zero will take at least the gas and the coal away, it's kind of scary looking into the future, isn't it?
The worst thing at the moment is actually, the two worst things are the NDIS, which is an example of everyone wanting to have something and wanting someone else to pay for it, and the debt. So if you look at government debt, it increased dramatically because of the COVID and the lockdowns, and that just can't go away overnight. It's got to be gradually paid down. And to put it,
and that was a Liberal Party government acting like
but it was
like a Labor
it was
government.
in concert with the Labor Party. Did you ever hear the Labor Party put their hand up and say, "I'm sorry, Mr. Frydenberg, you're spending too much money"? No, it was always, "You're not spending enough money." So I call it the Frydenberg Chalmers debt problem. I don't think it's a Frydenberg problem. It's jointly owned, and it's partly a byproduct of 2008 and the GFC, when Wayne Swan, to whom Chalmers was a sort of sorcerer's apprentice at the time, he was his chief of staff, threw all this money at the economy to get us through the GFC. It wasn't a good idea then. It was an even worse idea when COVID came along, and now we're going to reap the disbenefits of that whirlwind.
So the debt's pretty big. It's $1 trillion. Well, if you bring in the state debt as well, I think federal's down to about 800 billion.
They expect it to be about 900 billion in a couple of years' time.
Right. So that's federal debt, and then we've got state debt. And we've got Victoria blown out.
160 bill.
They're heading to 200.
Queensland's, I keep getting confused with net debt, but I think they're looking at about 90 bill. But that's where a lot of the coal royalties are coming in, so they might not do as badly. New South Wales is also off the scales. The only state that's got any sort of credibility on this is Western Australia.
There is a mood out there at the moment in economic circles to this idea globally, this idea of being very, what economists would call Keynesian or modern monetary theory, which is sort of an extreme version of that, where the idea is that you just spend and, who cares? I mean, that's going to stimulate the economy. If you're spending, you're injecting a stimulus. By injecting a stimulation into the economy, then the economy will become more productive, and then eventually everything will even out.
Yeah, so modern monetary theory's sort of got two arms to it. I call it magical monetary theory.
Yeah, mad monetary theory.
Or mad monetary theory. The idea was you could borrow as much as you like. Interest rates are so low because when this debt was incurred, official interest rate was 0.14. So you're a government, really, whether you're spending on something good or bad doesn't matter because it's not costing you anything and you can sort of gradually reel it back. The problem they've got now is that we're possibly heading to an official interest rate of 4.85, which is just phenomenally higher payments, which is going to bear on the budget. But the other part of the theory was that, well, if there's a bit of inflation, you can fix that by using what they call fiscal means, so upping taxes. Now, what politician in their right mind is going to up taxes? So it was always a bonkers theory.
Yeah. There's no incentive there for raising taxes.
And the thing is, it relied on interest rates being wrong. So an interest rate...
Just before we get on, let's do the math on that, okay? So let's use round numbers, right? $1 trillion is $1 million, right? If we're talking interest rates going from 0.1% to around 5%, that's an increase of interest rates of 50 times, right? So the interest bill, 5% on 1 trillion, is 50 billion a year. Now, let's say you want to pay that 1 trillion down over 20 years.
The paper's saying they're going to be paying 60 million a day. So,
60 million a day.
So that's 180 billion a year, I think.
180 billion a year.
Or closer to 200 billion.
But. Yeah, I don't know what the average interest rate is on our bonds and our debt at the moment, but I think when ScoMo said before the last election it was averaging at 2.85%. It all depends on the time that it all expires.
That's right.
But anyway, the average, let's assume the average goes up to 5. Okay, so we've got $1 trillion, 5% of that's 50 billion for your interest bill per year. Let's say you want to pay that trillion down over 20 years, that's 50 billion a year. So it's 100 billion. Our whole federal budget's 650, roughly.
Yeah.
That's a big chunk. That's a lot of spending you've got to cut if you want to kind of be responsible.
That's why I say that's one of the problems. The other problem, the NDIS is projected to be about 90 billion. I think it is within a few years' time.
Per year?
Yeah, it's around 36 at the moment. We'll find out exactly in a couple of days.
What's the problem? I mean, the NDIS, I've got a certain personal connection to it I've seen it be tremendous for families who have got children or adults with severe disabilities, but it's just been extended too far, right? The definition of disability has gone too far now.
Well, what happened in the first place was the states were providing what services were being provided. Julia Gillard decided that the federal government should do that, and it was going to be 50-50. Well, it's not 50-50 anymore. The federal government's spending a lot more. It seems to effectively be uncapped. There's no means test on it. So you can be a billionaire and you can be yourself on the NDIS, or one of your dependents can be on the NDIS. Well, in my world, bad luck happens to all of us, and that might sound cruel when you've got a disability, but if you can afford to look after it yourself, then you should. And there's an element of self-respect too in my concept of a citizen, that if I can pay for it, I should pay for it. I shouldn't expect low-income taxpayers to pay for it out of their taxes.
Well, I would slightly disagree with that, but that there is a range of views on that in our community. There is a range of views on how much the government should be involved in aged care, in healthcare, in all of these things. How much Medicare should we have? How much can we afford? How much should we be taking care of each other as a collective, et cetera, et cetera? And that's the constant battle between left and right thinking. And it's not that the right doesn't care, it's that the right wants to have the economy strong enough so that the wealth is there to be able to look after these things just like the left do. But are we going? We're obviously going too far in one direction. We just can't keep up. I mean, the cost of Medicare, the cost of the NDIS, the cost of aged care, and as you said, we're going to see $11.3 billion being spent on increasing the pay of aged care workers, and I think these are all very important parts of our economy that I think are maybe need to be looked at first if we are going to have government and collective. We want to be doing it around things like this.
So you're falling into the trap. You say these are parts of our economy that need to be looked at first. You've got a little bit of a command and control mindset when you start talking like that.
Right.
Economies work best when they're organic. And you've got a whole lot of needs out there, and people sort these needs out by working out how much they have to pay for them and how much they can afford to pay for them. So you manage to confine your needs within the amount of resources you've got to put to it.
Right.
What's happening at the moment is the government's coming along and saying, well, that's wrong, and that's wrong, and that's wrong, and we're going to fix it. And the way we're going to fix it is we're going to borrow money and we're going to spend it on those things. And what that does is it A, causes inflation, and B, takes resources from people that they might want to allocate here, and the government says, no, they're going over here. And so what we're doing, it's a dog trying to chase its tail.
Yeah.
So we're spending more money than we've got, doing things the government thinks we ought to be able to do, and that then leads to people ramping up wages because there's more money, chasing fewer goods. That also causes inflation. Over time, you end up with a disaster, which is one reason why smaller government's a good idea.
Yeah. So we have a mindset in Australia, right, that the government should fix everything. That if something goes wrong, immediately the media are, the government should do something about it. And I play this game with people where I say, listen to an ABC news bulletin, right? And then after each story say, and the government should do something about it. And it works 99% of the time.
And,
right?
and worse, the person that they've used as the example of this, suddenly, because they're a victim, becomes an instant expert on what you can do. And the next thing you know, they're Australian of the Year, and they're telling us we all need to spend another $1 billion on this problem, and because I've suffered from this problem, I know what to do.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Yeah, and it's very hard for a politician to go out there and say, well, no, we shouldn't give any money to disabled people, or we should give less money to people who are sick, or we should give less money because you look like a bastard.
You'll sound like, and that's my job, to be Scrooge, to be the bastard, because I don't have to get elected.
Yes, got it. I understand what you're saying now. Okay, so Scrooge, which you're not. The thing that we're not getting, right? The thing as Aussies we're not understanding, I think, is the way an economy works.
Yeah.
Right. And that is that there's a certain amount of productivity, a certain amount of value in an economy, right? And that's determined by how much we produce, how much we can sell abroad, how much we can sell domestically, what we're producing and making for each other, the value that we are creating as a community. And then the distribution of that value, the free market liberals would say, well, the best and most efficient distribution will come from letting the market do its thing, right? With some exceptions, I guess. But generally,
I'm not against some government welfare.
No pure libertarians.
No. I think that welfare ought to be a trampoline rather than a safety net.
Yes.
But then there's some people who, if they get on a trampoline, they're going to hurt themselves because there isn't something to project them up into. So there's always going to be need.
Yeah.
But you want to deal with that need as efficiently as possible.
Yeah.
And you want it to be a smaller proportion of the economy as you can possibly manage.
So let's talk about the benefits of the philosophy of liberalism, because I don't think that's spoken about. We all know about the benefits of socialism, right? We take money from people and we give it to the people who seem to look like they need it, right? Okay. With liberalism, how does that money get distributed in a liberal economy?
Well, essentially it gets distributed by individuals. So the whole philosophy of liberalism comes down to the individual is the best person placed to work out what their needs are and their preferences and what costs to trade off. It also, so it doesn't just come back to the individual, it comes back to civil society. But the idea is that decisions are made as close to the problem as they can be. Catholic Church has got a name for it, they call it subsidiarity. And part of the problem is that there's almost an infinite amount of information out there, and central organisations are very bad at dealing with it. So, we've seen that with COVID, where the story changed a number of times. We have models that were completely unrealistic. We've seen it with the Reserve Bank. 2 years ago, the Reserve Bank governor was saying, don't worry about interest rates going up to 2024. All right, and now what's he doing? He's putting as many in there as he can before he has to retire in September, because he doesn't want to go down in history as the man who let inflation out of the box. But they're both examples of there was information out there. If they were paying attention to it, they would have made different decisions, but they didn't. So if you leave these decisions to individuals, they might still make the wrong decision, but they'll be a lot happier with it because it was their wrong decision rather than someone up above. But the chances are they'll make many more right decisions because they also have access to information which you can't possibly have. You know,
right, it's like the government trying to solve the problem of providing care to the disabled or the sick, instead of leaving it to the disabled and the families and the community around them, or the sick in the hospital, the doctors and the medical, to say, this is the way that we need to spend this money. This is the best way to spend it. It's that central control, that belief among the left that they are better, that they can determine better than the individuals involved in the situation are, that they can fix it.
Well, that's why we call it the nanny state. You know, it's sort of, oh, there's a problem over there. I know what to do about it. Not bothering to ask you what you think you might want to do about it, or giving you a range of options and saying, well, you know, you could do this, you could do that, you could do that. Here are the benefits and here are the costs. You know, it's just, no, and it has to be a one-size-fits-all solution for government. You know, because they can't distinguish between people. But one size doesn't fit all. You know, we talk about diversity in every area, apart from the areas where it matters.
Now, one thing that people don't get about economics, I think, and liberal economics, is the idea of pricing. Like, what is a price? How are prices determined? Why doesn't the government just come around and say, well, we're going to make energy prices, we're going to lower, we're going to cap rent, we're going to cap rent. Pricing has a different definition.
It's the most important information, the price of something, because it encapsulates a whole lot of things that you can't encapsulate in any other way. So, you know, so they have capped the price of gas at the moment at $12 a gigajoule, which, given that, you know, it was $3 a gigajoule a couple of years ago, probably not going to do too much damage. However, the price of gas is a signal to investors and to people in the industry that it's up there, there's a profitable market. That means there's probably a shortage. It means we need more of it. We'll go out there and we'll drill. It also means, because they'll have to attract the resources from somewhere else, they can afford to pay higher salaries. They might have to import rigs from overseas or build new rigs or whatever. So it's very important. Then when it's really low, when it's below the cost of production, that's a signal that, hey, stop doing all that drilling. You know, it's not profitable.
But I'm talking about, like, people not understanding where prices come from. I mean, I think a lot of people in the world think, and I did for the first 20 years of my life, thought that prices were made up by somebody. Pricing is actually the result of what the market's prepared to pay for something versus, you know, what the market's prepared to produce it for. So it's the demand and the supply, right? It's the. Sorry,
I don't like that phrase market, because in most cases there isn't a market as, you know, say a stock market. You can sort of see it's got rules, blah blah blah. Fruit market, you can see it. The market's really just a sort of aggregation of people, individuals like you and me, making decisions. And you know, you might have an old TV, and I might be looking for a second one at home, and you might think, well, you know, if I take this to the dump, I'm going to lose my Saturday afternoon. I've got vouchers, I've got petrol, and I say, look, I'll give you $50 for it. You say, yeah, fine, done. Whereas it might actually have a value to someone else.
Who doesn't,
who's got a business of recycling it or whatever.
Or has a free Saturday afternoon. I'll go to the dump. So, no, mate, it'll be $250.
So there's no kind of real market there. It's just what kind of suits us.
Right.
And prices are interesting because they can often, settle at what they call an equilibria. And it can be different in different countries. Even under the same conditions, because people just, you know, okay, that's what we've got to spend for that. Because, you know, things are made up of the ingredients, the resources that go into them, but they're also made up of a whole lot of other things that are flexible.
Yes, that's right. And economists and central planners think that they can work all that out.
That's right.
Predict it.
And this is the perfect price.
You might have a different idea of what's value to you and what's value. And so if we can negotiate and do a deal, then away you go. So leave it alone.
And it all sort of filters out. So what you're calling the market is this filtering out, so that eventually people have some rough idea what they're going to be having to pay, and that allows them to plan ahead and, you know,
and that's
do
where
things.
The pricing comes from, right? We sort of go, okay, well, the car's going to cost me that most of the time. Right. So we're basically making the case for smaller government and less government manipulation of things. We're seeing a lot of manipulation. This is budget, coming back to the budgets and what they are. This is where the government says, well, this is how we're going to use our money to fix society.
Yeah.
And you expect that a Labor government, being left-wing, is going to believe in bigger government, more centralised control, and that they extract efficiencies from that, and that therefore they're going to be the ones who are best to determine where all this money goes.
Yeah, I wish that were true, that it's because they're Labor. The previous coalition government was pretty good in high spending.
Yeah.
And if you look at the UK, it's the Conservatives who've put the highest tax rates in place in 70 years.
Yeah.
So there's a bit of a disease on my side of the argument. So people like me obviously aren't doing a good enough job. That these politicians are getting in there and they're brokering deals that are too easy for the common good.
Well, you can't get elected. When you've got the left side of politics throwing money out, going, here are all the goodies, and you go out there as another politician countering them, saying, well, no, actually, guys, we can't afford to spend that on that, and we can't afford to spend on that. Immediately, as I said before, you look like the bad guy. They're the good guys, so you can't get elected.
Yeah.
So now everyone's giving out lollies, which means we've got a world, in the Western world, in the democratic world, we're running up ridiculous levels of debt everywhere. The United States is now at 33 trillion. They've reached their debt cap. What everyone's terrified about in America right now is, and it should impact us, we should be worried about it too, is they're thinking of actually defaulting on that debt for the first time ever, actually saying to the people that have loaned them the money through their bonds, saying, we're not going to pay you back. Now, that would send disturbing shockwaves.
I don't think that's going to happen.
No, it's not a feasible thing.
You really do become a banana republic when the country itself defaults.
But it's a pretty weird situation because they're at that cap, they want to spend, and now you've got this deadlock in government. They can't release the spend, they can't release the money. And you've got the Republicans saying, well, no, we need you to reduce spending, Mr. Biden and Democrats. We need you to drop that spending. You're not getting an increase in the cap. And the Democrats are saying, well, we need it. We need to have this spending. So now in Australia, we've got $1 trillion in debt and rising. Interest rates are rising. What's going to happen to the Western world if we don't start to tighten our belts?
We'll end up looking like Japan. They've got a couple of 100% of GDP in debt, and they've been trying to borrow their way out of mediocre growth for 20, 30 years now. And
so GDP is the gross domestic product. That's the productivity of the whole country we're talking about before, all the value
the output?
That's created, the output.
Productivity is a different issue. It's how few resources you need to produce that output.
Okay, sorry, right. Okay, so our output, you've got Japan in a situation where their debt, when you say it's 100% of GDP,
couple of 100%, over a couple of 100%.
Right. That means that their debt is 2 times plus their annual.
Yeah, that's right.
Gross domestic product.
Yeah.
Where are we on that scale? We're not too bad.
No, we're about 35, 40% at the moment.
Okay. United States?
In international terms, our debt doesn't look that bad.
Right, yeah, that's what I thought.
But, that's like going to a McDonald's and seeing a whole lot of people with their hips hanging over their belts and saying, oh, geez,
I'm not that fat
I'm not that fat after all. You mightn't be
you're not
as
healthy.
fat as them, but you're not healthy. And the game is being healthy, not just being better than everyone else or better than most.
So how unhealthy are we, Ray?
Look, it's not disastrous. Some decent productivity growth, a bit of inflation, unfortunately, because most economies have inflated their way out of these sorts of problems, which means that over time with inflation, the value of dollars goes down. It's a form of taxation effectively because you're losing some of your wealth. But you don't sort of notice it in the same way you do as if Mr. Chalmers raises your income tax by 10% or something like that. It's just part of sort of what's going on.
Subtle. Yeah, my 100,000 in the bank isn't worth what it was 2 years ago. So I've actually had wealth taken from me. I've had that accumulated wealth, that money that I put aside, that I worked for, that energy that I put in back then to save for my future has just gone down in value because of inflation. So in a sense, it is like a tax, right? Yeah.
So it's similar to what happened after World War II. So Menzies got rid of all that debt very gradually. And to put it in perspective, the amount that we borrowed for COVID is roughly similar to 1 year's worth of borrowing in World War II. or 1 year's worth of expenditure, which was mostly borrowed because they didn't have the savings for it. So then it took them 17, 20 or something years to pay most of that back, and it was done by the economy growing faster than the debt, and over a long period of time. But that takes a lot of discipline, and the current society doesn't have a lot of discipline. You know, my parents, you know, the house they lived in, no one would live in the way it was now. You know, I can remember we had an ice chest one stage when I was a kid, so we'd just come back to Australia, and that's what the going. That's what people used rather than fridges when we left, and when we came back, fridges were the go, but we still had that. No one would buy a house.
But
like
what a younger generation who believes that they're worse off than their parents and their grandparents?
That's because they're told that, and there's some psychological reasons. You know, we always, as human beings, you always worry more about the thing that'll kill you rather than the thing that'll make you better. And that's an extreme sort of case, but we always worry more about the downside than the upside.
But it's true that the average cost of a house now is a heck of a lot more annual earnings, percentage. You have to work for a certain number of years more to own a home.
It is, but until recently the interest rate was a lot lower. Yeah. So one of the things we do is an affordability index, and until the last 4 or 5 years, it wasn't that much less affordable in terms of repayments than it was in the 90s. The big problem was saving the deposit. So what had happened is interest rates went down, and assets tend to go up as interest rates go down. So house prices have gone up. You've also got to take into account that the houses these days are much larger than the houses even in the 90s. You know, like 120, 150 squares in the 80s, 90s was a reasonable sized house. Now it's a small house.
Well, you look at
3 bedrooms rather than 4 bedrooms. No entertainment room. You know,
our expectations are up.
Our expectations have gone up as well.
Right. So the average house price goes up because the average house is a much more lovely house. Well, but I mean, you're never going to get elected with that message, Graham.
No, well, I'm not trying to get elected, but it's another example.
The politicians are, and that's the problem, right? Democracy's failing us.
But the other problem we've now got with houses is that this federal government, and this will be in the budget, is welcoming something like 400,000 extra immigrants. Now, I'm not anti-migration, but we can't handle that number of people with the resources that we've got while we're trying to spend as much money as we are on things like the energy transition and infrastructure.
Well, that's a whole other story.
And that housing affordability is going to be a huge issue. It's generally not the federal government's fault, it's generally the state government's fault, but in this case, they're both contributing to it, and the federal government with this huge immigration regime is the biggest culprit at the moment.
You hear the left-wing parties talking about, you know, well, we want net zero, right? We want no gas and we want no coal. What the hell are we going to do for tax? And what are we going to do for energy? And the cost of energy is going to, you know, it's going to kill us.
Well, they're having a parliamentary inquiry into a Greens bill here in Queensland, and my job this afternoon and the weekend and on Monday is to put together a submission pointing out how lunatic that idea is. Because, you know, we think of coal, oil and gas in terms of cars and electricity. They're also steel. They're also fertiliser. It's also plastics. You can't make a Tesla without coal, oil and gas. Look at the things that they run on.
Petrochemicals are in everything. The surfaces here, everything.
So you stop that, modern society stops. How do we feed ourselves?
Yeah, it's crazy.
How many people do you want to kill? That's basically the question.
Yeah.
How many people do you want to kill?
Yeah. I famously put that question to a Greens candidate during an election campaign at a rather heated debate. It didn't go down too well. She got elected. There you go. But we are in a really difficult time because we're simultaneously saying we've got to get rid of coal and oil, but gas, is probably the cleanest of the fossil fuels. Well, we're not going to let you do that. We're not going to allow you to frack that, although we are starting to do some. But we've got the Greens saying now, no, we don't want any more fracking up north. And then they're saying no nuclear, right? It's insane. I mean, we're not going to be able to meet our energy needs with just renewable energy, or so-called renewable energies, right? With solar and
So I guess where this impacts on the budget is that the budget will have a table in there saying this is what we expect in growth.
Yeah.
And that's more or less well, the Treasury has their own figures, and they look at world growth figures, which they'll borrow from the World Bank or the IMF or whatever.
Yep.
Those figures, I'm sure, at the moment are being done without taking into account that what we're doing is radically increasing the price of energy. And the more costly energy becomes, the less there is to spend on anything else. So there's a direct relationship between cheap energy and standard of living. We're now reversing that, and that's a huge problem. You look at these assumptions and you say, these guys are actually not factoring reality in, but it's going to come around and bite them. So the Treasurer may well get up and say, oh, we're going to have a, well, they may well even have a surplus this year, but I'm projecting surpluses forward for the next 5 years. That all depends on these dinky assumptions they've made, and they're never right. And things come from left field. Well, this is going to come from left field because they're not actually thinking about it. They think that you go down to Bunnings and you just swap out your petrol-driven thing for your electric thing without understanding that there's a complex network out there that's feeding energy into us, and there's a whole lot of little decisions that need to be made. And what the government, it's another example of what we were talking about earlier. The government is making this huge decision for everyone instead of letting the people involved in the network make the decisions themselves.
But extremely complex decisions with millions and millions of factors are best made by 3 politicians sitting in a room, I think, Graham. It's always the best way. God help us.
Well, you'll make the Reserve Bank behave better by, instead of having just one Philip Lowe, have a board with 5 of them.
Philip Lowe's, 5 economists. I'm sorry that we don't have more time to get into that. We'll have to get you back to talk about the Reserve Bank, to talk about interest rates, and it's been fascinating lesson and learning for me, I've got to tell you, on this stuff, because I just don't think we teach it. Most people don't understand. We've got to stop rewarding pollies that go out there saying we're going to give you free stuff, and start rewarding the pollies that say, hey, we need to tighten our belt, we've got to get this debt down, we've got to make sure our country's safe and secure.
I think the lesson is, or the answer is that I didn't learn this at school, I learned it by living through it. And I'd like to pay tribute to one of my teachers, who was Paul Keating. Did a lot to educate the country on what's involved in running a good economy. And that was a result of the economic disaster that happened. And I suspect the bad news is we're going to have another disaster before we learn the lessons.
Another recession we have to have.
Well, 1983 was the recession that was the worst recession since the Great Depression.
Yeah.
That was the first year of the Hawke government, and that changed everything.
Yeah.
So,
all right, Graham, a lot more to think about in
crossed.
relation to the budget, rather than just the goodies we're getting and the tax we might be not having to pay or whatever. So a lot of food for thought, and really great having you on the other side interviews.
It's been fantastic.
Thanks for your time.
Yeah.
Take care. All right, well, that ends another episode of The Other Side Interviews, folks. We'll be back, don't forget, on Friday night with The Other Side Australia, which is our weekly news summary show, our main show, and every Tuesday night we have The Other Side Interviews. So The Other Side Interviews drops on Tuesdays at 6 on ADH TV, and The Other Side Australia drops on Friday nights at 8. Roughly. And we also are on demand, right? Every single day you can go on and check us out whenever you want to watch. And we also are out on different podcast platforms as well if you like to listen. This certainly shows that you can listen to as well as watch. But our main platform, ADH TV, make sure you get your friends onto it. That's the most important thing. If you like this conversation, you want to hear more conversations like this, the only way we're going to be able to continue to provide this kind of media to you is if you stop watching the other kind of media and join us here in the new media world by supporting us, by telling your friends, by helping us promote and get the word out there that there is another way to consume news and there is another kind of media out there that we can now start to give our valuable time to enjoying. And we'll do our best to keep producing content that's interesting and stimulating, but also informative and educational, and hopefully that'll improve our country. All right, you have a great week, and I'll see you Friday night. Take care.